I also want to mention that lying in a Birmingham hospital in England at the moment is Malala Yousafzai from Pakistan, who was shot by the Taliban for the crime of wanting girls to have an education. There's a petition afoot to get Malala the Nobel Peace Prize. And I urge you to go to the website. Well, you'll find the reference on richarddawkins.net. Go there and please sign the petition to get Malala the Nobel Peace Prize. I think of it as kicking the Taliban in their nasty little balls. On October the 9th of this year, Pew released a new poll showing that the nuns have climbed from 15% of the US population 5 years ago. They're now at 20%. That's 1 in 5. When I say nuns, you understand that's spelled N-O-N-E, not N-U-N. I had a friend who was in hospital once, and a nurse came to take her details down, sat on her bed with a form ticking things off and said religion, and my friend said none. And then later she overheard a couple of the nurses gossiping about her, and one of the nurses said to the other, "She doesn't look like a nun." So the nuns in this country, the NONEs in this country, have climbed to 20%, and it's 30% if you look at those between the ages of 18 and 29. Things are going in the right direction. Demographically, they're going in the right direction. Yet, although we are becoming, although you are becoming, I should say, because I'm not a US citizen, although you are becoming a real force to be reckoned with, there's no sign that politicians have actually woken up to that fact. And what you need to do, what we need to do, is to let politicians know that we are a major force in this country, cannot be ignored. The US Constitution states that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Yet I want to read you the following from various state constitutions from around the country. State Constitution of North Carolina, Article 6, Section 8. The following persons shall be disqualified for office. First, any person who shall deny the being of Almighty God. Arkansas, Article 9, Section 1. No person who denies the being of a god shall hold any office in the civil departments of this state, nor be competent to testify as a witness in any court. Maryland, Article 37. That no religious test ought ever to be required as a qualification for any office of profit or trust in this state, other than a declaration of belief in the existence of God. Pennsylvania, Article 1, Section 4. No person who acknowledges the being of a God and a future state of rewards and punishments shall, on account of his religious sentiments, be disqualified to hold any office. South Carolina, Article 17, Section 4. No person who denies the existence of a supreme being shall hold any office under this Constitution. Tennessee, Article 9. No person who denies the being of God or a future state of rewards and punishments shall hold any office in the civil department of this state. Texas, Article 1, Section 4. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust in this state, nor shall anyone be excluded from holding office on account of his religious sentiments, provided he acknowledge the existence of a supreme being. Before going any further, I have to acknowledge that English common law is guilty of some discrimination in eligibility to stand for Parliament. The following is an article of English common law. Idiots are disqualified from election to Parliament. John F. Kennedy set the tone for our attitude to the religious beliefs of candidates for president. He said, "I believe in a president whose religious views are his own private affair, neither imposed by him upon the nation or imposed by the nation upon him as a condition to holding office." But while it's of course right that no religious test should ever be imposed as a qualification to stand for election, that's very different from saying that voters are obliged to ignore a candidate's religious belief when deciding whether to vote for him. Candidates may put forward their economic policy, their foreign policy, their health policy, and so on. These are much discussed by journalists, pundits. They're the topics of discussion in presidential debates. But suppose we know that one of the candidates privately believes the world is only 6,000 years old. You may say that's nothing to do with his taxation policy, foreign policy, etc. But I want to suggest that voters are entitled to take such lunatic beliefs into account. Not because those beliefs will affect the candidate's conduct as a president directly, necessarily, but because this is evidence that he is an ignorant fool, and you can't trust an ignorant fool to make good decisions as president. It tells you something about the sort of brain he has on his shoulders. As it happens, neither of the two leading candidates in the current election believes anything like that. But some of the earlier candidates for the Republican nomination certainly did believe that. And if any of them had emerged as the Republican nominee, I would hope that neither journalists nor his opponent, President Obama, would have held back from attacking those beliefs on the grounds that religious beliefs are private and not to be intruded upon. It's entirely right that John F. Kennedy should not have been debarred from standing because of his religion. But even with him, if I'd been a journalist interviewing him, or if I'd been Nixon, his opponent, I would not have hesitated to ask him, "Mr. Kennedy, do you seriously believe that when a priest blesses a wafer, it literally turns into the body of a first-century Jew?" I suspect that Mr. Kennedy believed no such thing, but he was forced to pretend to be a Catholic, a devout Catholic, because that was a condition for getting elected. It's a tragedy when a great politician is forced to be a liar in order to get elected. Paul Ryan says he's a Catholic. I hope somebody will ask him that very question very publicly. Now suppose we have a candidate who talks a lot about his fiscal policy, his foreign policy, economic policy, and so on, health policy. You may or may not agree with him on those. But would you wish to confine the discussion to those issues alone if you knew that he privately believed that a known 19th century con man called Joseph Smith was a divinely inspired prophet? Suppose that, following this 19th century charlatan, our hypothetical candidate believes the following. First, contrary to conclusive DNA evidence and all archaeological evidence, Native American tribes are a group of Jews who migrated from Palestine to America around 600 BC. Second, Jesus visited America shortly after his resurrection. You may say this is no more improbable than the biblical story of the resurrection itself, and that's true, but the biblical story is old. The Mormon story of Jesus visiting America was quite simply made up in the 19th century. Let's look at the Book of Mormon. Suppose our hypothetical presidential candidate believes that Joseph Smith was guided by an angel, Moroni, to dig up some golden plates on which were written characters of an ancient language which he called Reformed Egyptian. He put a seer stone in a hat, buried his face in the hat, and looked at the seer stone. One by one, characters of this so-called Reformed Egyptian would appear in the stone, together with the English translation. Smith said the English word, which would be written down by a scribe sitting behind a curtain, so he couldn't see what was going on. The scribe repeated the word, and when Smith approved it, the stone displayed a new word in its place, and so on until all 531 pages of the book had been written down in English. The English of 1830, the English that Smith and his followers would naturally have spoken? Not at all. If you have a look at the Book of Mormon, you might be amazed that the style is nothing to do with Victorian English, nothing to do with 1830s English. It is the English of the 16th century. Look at the layout, chapters, verses, footnotes, just like the King James Bible. Now listen to some of the prose, remembering it was written in or shortly before 1830. Mark Twain, by the way, remarked that if you removed all occurrences of "it came to pass," the Book of Mormon would be reduced to a pamphlet. You also need to know that the land bountiful is believed by Mormons to refer to somewhere in America. 3 Nephi 11. And now it came to pass that there were a great multitude gathered together of the people of Nephi round about the temple which was in the land bountiful. And they were marveling and wondering one with another, and were showing one to another the great and marvelous change which had taken place. And it came to pass that while they were thus conversing one with another, they heard a voice as if it came out of heaven. And they cast their eyes round about, for they understood not the voice which they heard. So on and so on. And it came to pass that again they heard the voice, and they understood it not. And again the third time they did hear the voice, and did open their ears to hear it. And their eyes were towards the sound thereof, and they did look steadfastly towards heaven, from whence the sound came. And behold, the third time they did understand the voice which they heard, and it said unto them, Behold, my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased, in whom I have glorified my name, hear ye him. So even the words is plagiarized from the King James Bible. If nothing else did, and plenty else does, all that pseudo-biblical language, rather ineptly lifted from the King James Bible, brands Joseph Smith a fraud and a charlatan. Would you want a president who was too stupid to see through Joseph Smith? He does tout himself, in my opinion rather implausibly, as able to balance a budget. Actually, long before the episode of reading the Book of Mormon by sticking his face into a hat, Joseph Smith had already established a reputation as a fake and a swindler. He'd built up a track record in the area as a psychic diviner of buried treasure. He claimed to be able to see the treasure underground by looking through his hat. Everything about the Book of Mormon reeks of fake. Joseph Smith was a fraud. It's written all over him. An obvious charlatan. Now that's not an interesting fact in itself. There have been numerous charlatans down the ages. The question you have to ask yourself is, could you vote for a presidential candidate? A candidate for the job of most powerful man in the world with his finger on the nuclear button, who is a gullible fool who believes Joseph Smith? Now I could imagine a retort to what I've just said. Suppose the other candidate is a devout Christian. Perhaps suppose he believes that Jesus walked on water, turned water into wine and so on. Aren't his beliefs equally ridiculous? Well, we have to ask the question whether the other candidate, whoever that might be, really is a devout Christian. I must say in this case I doubt it. But he could very well be an atheist, and he would have to pretend to be a devout Christian in order to get elected. So we put that on one side and ask, in any case, whether Christianity, even fundamentalist Christianity, is quite as daft, quite as idiotic as Mormonism, and I think it isn't. Christian scriptures are genuinely ancient. The translations from Hebrew and Greek that Christians use are in a language contemporary with the translators. The Book of Mormon is not ancient, it's recent. The language of its alleged translation is ludicrously anachronistic. Everything about it proclaims it to be a palpable fake, as if Smith's cock and bull story of golden plates hadn't already given the game away. Smith was obviously a man steeped in the King James Bible, and he made up a whole new set of scriptures in the same style of English. Setting aside the mountebankery of Smith's English style, many of the core beliefs of Mormonism run counter to everything we know for certain about the colonization of America. As I said before, DNA evidence utterly refutes the claim that Native Americans are a remnant of the House of Israel. The idea that Jesus visited America is preposterous. The idea that Adam and Eve did too is even worse. It is at least arguable that Jesus existed. The traditional Mormon belief in the inferiority of black people, only recently renounced for reasons of political expediency, is as scientifically inaccurate as it is obnoxious. The great prophet, so-called, Brigham Young, even prescribed the death penalty for interracial marriage. Joseph Smith himself was given to having revelations when they were convenient to himself, as for example, when he would have a revelation that God wanted him to take a particularly desirable young woman as yet another wife. Now, it's of course possible that a presidential candidate who is born Mormon no longer believes it. But if this candidate has served as a Mormon bishop, if he has excommunicated people for the crime of leaving Mormonism, excommunication will seem a bit superfluous for the crime of leaving Mormonism. If he has baptized his dead father-in-law, who was an atheist, well, to say the least, we are entitled to ask him to stand up and ask some questions. While no one blinks an eye over the fact that atheists are disqualified from office, or indeed politicians are afraid to mention being an atheist, some even contend that atheists are not even real US citizens, we are accused of lacking morality, and yet no one seems to be allowed to even question a candidate who gets his or her moral guidance from a racist, misogynistic charlatan. I would like to see journalists ask any presidential candidate about his religious views. If the candidate happens to profess Mormonism, then I think he should be asked by journalists and by his opponent, do you believe this list of Mormon beliefs? If so, you are of course entitled to stand for president, but we as voters are equally entitled to conclude that you are a gullible fool who is not fit to be president. Don't let a presidential candidate hide behind the wall of separation. That is not what it was designed for. Thank you very much.